Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Tonight, I am reprinting some models that I tried to do. I think it was last night or yesterday. I kind of messed up one, so I am redoing them today. So, yeah, there's that. That's really it. That's all that's really going on right now. Um, Printed them. Realized I didn't print an even number of like feet and stuff. So I'm gonna be going through that and just reprinting stuff, saving it. You know what you do. All right, let's see. Let's get back to the audiobooks.
Chapter 6 The Battle for Nuln. The days grew darker. Fear and hunger were constant companions. The great Skaven plot drew to its inevitable conclusion, and it seemed to be our lot to be drawn into it. And yet, along with terror and horror, there was hope and heroism. As well as loss, there was honor. The hour of utmost danger arrived, and I pride myself that my companion and I were not found wanting. From My Travels with Gotrek, Volume 3, by Herr Felix Jaeger, Altdorf Press, 2505. Thanquol sat brooding on his great throne. Around him was marked a pentacle, inscribed with the head of the horned rat, and surrounded by a double circle of the most potent protective symbols. He had invoked all of the great defensive spells he knew to shield him from the dire forces gnawing at his destiny. These were runes sovereign against curses, diseases, ill luck, and all manner of death-bringing spells. They numbered among the most powerful wards the Grey Seer had learned in a long career pursuing the darker mysteries. It was a measure of how bad the situation had become that Thanquol thought it necessary to expend so much of his carefully hoarded mystical power to invoke them all. Thanquol lowered his great horned head into his hands and beat a tattoo on his temples with his claws. He was worried. Things were not going according to plan. Events were starting to slip beyond his control. He could sense it. His highly trained Grey Seer's intuition could feel forces at work here that were sending matters spiraling beyond the ability of any Skaven, no matter how clever, to predict. He was not quite sure how it had all happened. At first, everything had gone so well. His agents reported the destruction of the Black Ship, and he knew that once more his unwitting pawns, Jaeger and Gurnison, had done his work for him. Mere days later, the Council of 13 had authorized an increase in size of his invasion force. It looked like utter crushing victory over the humans was within his grasp. But then the accursed plague had started to spread among his own forces. Soon the underways were full to bursting with sick and dying Skaven warriors. As fast as the bodies could be burned, dozens more followed. Even the Skaven slaves manning the funeral ovens were falling sick. The symptoms, a hacking, snuffling cough, an evil pus filling the lungs, and finally a sudden onset of fatal spasms, were remarkably similar to the disease striking down the humans on the surface. Perhaps it was the same plague. It would not be the first time a contagion had made the leap between the two races. As if the plague were not bad enough, another menace had arisen. The corridors now swarmed with large, fierce, hungry rats. They were everywhere, devouring the corpses, eating the food supplies, fighting over scraps, defecating and urinating everywhere, helping spread the cursed disease, and at the same time starving the army. Even now, some of them lurked, beady-eyed, in the corner of his chamber, avoiding his pentagram but gnawing the furnishings. He could hear some of them moving beneath his throne. They must have been there when he cast his spells. Now, they were trapped inside with him. It would not have been nearly so bad if the offending creatures had not been rats. It was almost a sign that the horned rat had turned his snout away from the great invasion force and withdrawn his blessing from the army. Certainly some of the more superstitious warriors were starting to mutter such things, and none of Thanquol's pointed speeches and sermons had reassured them. It did no good for him to point out that the humans were suffering just as much, if not more, from these twin catastrophes. Their granaries were empty, their food supplies consumed by the verminous host. The Skaven warriors simply did not believe him. They did not have access to Thanquol's extensive spy network on the surface. They saw only that they themselves were starving, and that their comrades were falling ill, and that there was a good chance that they in turn would be the next to be smitten by the plague. Morale had suffered, and no one knew better than Thanquol that morale was always a chancy thing at best for a Skaven army. He had done his utmost to hunt down those shirkers who muttered disloyal and treacherous remarks. He had assigned elite units of storm vermin to execute deserters on the spot. He had blasted several traitors himself with his most spectacular and destructive spells. But it had all been to no avail. The rot had set in. The army was slowly starting to fall to pieces, and there did not seem to be anything he could do about it. Thanquol kicked one of the rats from under his feet, where it was gnawing at the bones of the last messenger who had brought him bad news. It flew through the air and impacted on the curtain of spells surrounding the pentagram. Sparks flickered, smoke belched, and the rat gave an eerie, keening cry as it died. The air was full of the smell of burned fur and scorched flesh as the creature fried in its own body fat. Thanquol's whiskers twitched in appreciation, and he gave a brief savage smirk of satisfaction before returning to his brooding. Since word of the army's misfortune had filtered back to Skavenblight, no more reinforcements had arrived. It was not quite the overwhelming mass of Skaven warriors he had hoped for, but it would be enough if Thanquol used all his resources of cunning and far-sighted planning. Something would have to be done to save the situation, and soon, while there was still an army left that was capable of fighting. He did not doubt that he still had enough troops at his command to overwhelm the human city if they attacked swiftly and savagely and with the advantage of surprise. Even if the army then dissolved, he would have achieved his goal. Nuln would be conquered, and Thanquol could report success to the Council of 13. It would then be up to his masters to rush garrison troops here to hold the
I'm
city.
dumb. I just realized what this is.
If they did not get here in time, that would not be Thanquol's fault. The more Thanquol thought of it, the more this plan made sense. He could still achieve his assigned mission. He could still grasp his share of glory. He could then shift the blame, for anything that happened afterwards, to where it belonged, upon his incompetent underlings and those traitors to the Skaven cause who deserted the army just before its hour of triumph. He reviewed the forces under his control. He still had close to 5,000 almost healthy warriors, drawn mostly from Clan Scab. He still had several teams of gutter runners and a cadre of Clan Eshin assassins. The various foolish adventures undertaken by their treacherous leaders had left him with only a token force from Clan Scryer and Clan Pestilence. Isaac Grottle and his force of rat ogres, though, were still a formidable presence. He knew that a simple frontal assault was not necessarily the best of plans under the circumstances. What he needed was a bold stroke that would lead to certain and overwhelming victory, and he believed he knew how that could be achieved. Soon, his spies told him, the breeder the humans called the Elector Countess would be giving a masked ball in a futile effort to distract her court from their troubles. If the palace could be taken with all the human nobles inside, then the human army of Nuln would be left leaderless and easy prey to the Skaven assault. If the raid could be timed so that the two attacks were combined, so much the better. On the night the Skaven took the palace, the city would also fall in blood and terror. Perhaps, with their chief breeder in Thanquol's clutches, the humans could even be induced to surrender. It would have to be done soon, if he was to have any hope of success, but at least here was a chance that he could snatch victory from the slavering jaws of defeat. Before that, though, he had another slight problem. He would have to negate the protective spells surrounding him so he could leave his chamber and begin giving orders. With a long-suffering sigh, Grayseer Thanquol began the incantations that would let him out from inside his own pentagram. Felix Jaeger kicked a huge fat rat from underfoot, sending it flying through the air to land in a midden heap. It turned and immediately began to devour the foulness in which it lay. Felix watched in hopeless disgust and despair. The rats were everywhere, eating anything that was edible and a lot that was not. There were thousands of them, possibly millions. At times, whole streets seemed to be nothing but a seething sea of vermin. His employer, Hines, had heard tales that they had taken to devouring babies in cribs and small children who got too close to them. Huge packs of the vile beasts flowed across the city streets, and the cats and dogs were too terrified to stop them. The only good thing was that the rats appeared to be mysteriously short-lived. It looked like they aged months within a few days. But when they died, the rats' corpses lay strewn like some hideous furry carpet across the cobbles. It was not natural. In fact, the whole thing stank of Skaven sorcery, and Felix wondered if there was some evil purpose to it. The city of Nuln appeared to be under a curse, Felix thought. The air smelled of sickness and disease, and human flesh burned on great pyres in the square outside the Temple of Mor. Whole tenement buildings had been boarded up and turned into tombs. Felix shuddered when he thought of the mouldering corpses of the dead within them. Even worse, though, were the thoughts of those who had been entrapped there alive, victims of the plague who no one wanted to help. There were hideous rumors circulating of people recovering from the plague, only to die of starvation. There were worse tales of cannibalism and folk feasting on flesh from the corpses of their family and friends. It was a horrifying thought, and it made Felix think that Sigmar and Ulrich had turned their gaze from this city. Ahead of him he heard the rumble of wheels and the tolling of a bell. He stepped aside to let the plague cart pass. The driver was garbed all in black, and his face was hidden by a skull mask and a great peaked cowl. On the back of the cart, an acolyte of Mor swung a censer of incense, presumably to protect him from the plague. It was like watching Death himself ride through the doomed city, accompanied by his servants. Felix could see the rotting corpses piled high on the backboard of the vehicle. The bodies were naked, already stripped of their valuables by their families or bold scavengers. Rats gnawed at the bodies. As Felix watched, he saw one tear out an eyeball and devour it whole. The plague carts moved constantly through the streets, bells tolling to announce their presence, summoning those still strong and healthy to dispose of the bodies of those who were not. But not even the plague carts were safe. If they stopped for a moment, the rats were upon them, fighting each other to feast upon the corpses. Felix's belly grumbled, and he pulled his belt a notch tighter. He hoped the others were having more luck in their foraging for food than he was. He had found nothing to eat on sale that had not been contaminated by rat droppings, and even that was being sold for 10 times its normal price. Some citizens were getting rich from the ruination of this mighty city. There were always those, he thought, who could find profit in even the most dire of situations. He wished that Gotrek would give up his mad desire to remain in the city. He'd already considered slipping away himself, joining those hosts of the poor and the lowly who had snatched up their few possessions and departed. He had not done so for several reasons. The first and best of them was that he would not desert his friends. The second was a desire to see this thing through to its end. He suspected that soon the dire events would reach their climax, and at least part of him wanted to find out what would happen. The final reason was simple. He had heard tales that the local nobles had quarantined the city, and that archers were shooting those who tried to depart by the public highways. Many of the barges, which had set sail from the docks in the past 2 desperate weeks, had returned, reporting imperial naval ships on the river sinking any vessel which tried to pass them. Perhaps a small band moving by night could slip through, but Felix did not want to try it without Gotrek. The lawless lands around the city would be even more dangerous now with all the local soldiers and road wardens enforcing the quarantine and bands of armed men robbing any refugees.
How many of these?
Law and order had already broken down in parts of the city inside the walls. By night, gangs of looters roamed the streets searching for food, helping themselves to anything that wasn't guarded by armed men. Only 2 nights ago, a mob had broken into the city granary, despite the presence of several hundred soldiers. They had broken down the gates, only to discover that the place was empty, filled only with the skeletons of the rats which had gorged themselves on the grain and then died. A group of feral children was watching him with hungry eyes. One of them was roasting a dead rat on a spit. Normally he would have tossed them a coin out of pity, but twice in the past few days he had almost been assaulted by such gangs. They had only turned back discouraged when he had drawn his sword and whipped it through the air menacingly. He remembered the words of Count Ostwald. The city was indeed under siege, but it was a siege of a most horrifying type. There were no siege towers, no weapons had been brought to bear except hunger and disease. There was no enemy which could be sought out and battled. Despair was the foe here, and there was no sword with which it could be fought. Ahead of him lay the blind pig. Outside it lolled several men-at-arms, mercenaries who had billeted themselves in the inn because they knew it and its owner, and stuck there now in a mass for their own protection. Felix knew them all, and they knew him, but even so they watched him warily as he came closer. They were hard men who had decided that since they could not outrun the plague, they might as well be comfortable while they waited for it to strike them down. The Elector Countess was offering double pay to those who helped keep the peace by reinforcing her guards, and the sadly depleted city watch. These men were earning their extra pay. "Any news?" one of them asked. A burly Kislevite giant, known as Big Boris. Felix shook his head. "Any food?" asked the other, a sour-faced Bretonian everyone called Hungry Stefan. Felix shook his head again and stepped past them into the inn. Heinz sat at the table beside the fire, warming his hands. Gotrek sat with him, glugging back an enormous stein of ale. "Looks like it would be rat pie for supper again," Heinz said. Felix was not quite sure if he was making a joke. "Young Felix has come back empty-handed." "At least you still have beer," Felix said. "If it were dwarf ale, we could live on it and nothing else," Gotrek said. "Many a campaign I've fought with nothing in my belly, save for half a barrel of Bugman's." "Unfortunately, it's not Bugman's," Felix said dryly. Since the food shortages began, the dwarf had taken to reminiscing constantly, and in a most annoying manner, about the nutrient powers of dwarf ale. "More Skaven have been seen," Heinz said. "The city guard clashed with them in the Middenplatz last night. And they seem to be foraging for food as well, or so the guard claimed." "Most likely want to make sure we're starving," Felix said sourly. "Whatever's going to happen is going to happen soon," Gotrek said. "There's something in the air. I can smell it." "It's beer you smell," Felix said. "Well, your Countess Emmanuel is throwing a big fancy-dress ball," Heinz said with a grin. "Maybe you'll be invited." "Somehow I doubt it," Felix said. He had not heard from the palace since he had been summoned by Ostwald 2 weeks ago to explain the burning of the Black Ship. Of course, since then, all those mansions on the hill had become fortified camps, as the rich and the blue-blooded isolated themselves in an effort to escape the plague. Rumour had it that any commoner even setting foot on those cobbled streets was shot on sight. "Typical of your bloody human nobles," Gotrek said, and belched. "The city's gone to the dogs, and what do? Throw a bloody party." "Maybe we should do the same," Heinz said. "There are worse ways to go." "Anybody seen Alyssa?" Felix asked, wanting to change the gloomy direction this conversation was taking. "She left earlier. Went for a walk with that peasant lad. Hans, is it?" Suddenly Felix wished he hadn't asked. Lurk Snitchtongue glanced around the gloomy chamber and controlled the urge to squirt the musk of fear. It took a mighty effort, for he could never in all his life recall being cornered by 3 such fearsome Skaven. He stifled a cough and fought to hold back a sneeze in case either would draw attention to him, but it was no use. Those 3 sets of malevolent eyes were drawn to his shivering form like iron filings to a magnet. Vilebroth Null, Isaac Grottle, and Heskett One-Eye all stared at him as if he were a tasty morsel. Particularly Isaac Grottle. Lurk wished his body would stop aching. He wished his paws would stop sweating. He wished the pain that threatened to split his skull would go away. He knew that they would not. He knew that he had the plague, and he knew that he was going to die, unless Vilebroth Null did as he had promised and interceded for him with the horned rat. Truly, Lurk thought, He was caught with his tail between the cleaver and the chopping block. The only way he could save his life was by doing what the terrifying plague monk leader said. Unfortunately, Vilebroth Nool wanted him to betray his master, Grey Seer Thanquol. Lurk shuddered to think of the consequences should that formidable sorcerer find out what had happened. The wrath of Thanquol was not something any sane Skaven cared to face. The three Skaven put their heads together once more and started to whisper. Lurk would have given anything to know what they were talking about. On second thoughts, considering they were probably discussing his fate, he might conceivably be able to live without the knowledge. Lurk cursed his own weakness. He had known he was in trouble when he saw who had been waiting in the chamber that Nool had led him to. He knew then, all too well, that the weeks of negotiations the abbot had alluded to had paid off, and two of the most powerful factions of Skavendom were arrayed alongside Clan Pestilens. In that secret chamber, far from eavesdroppers and shielded by Nool's potent sorcery, Heskett One-Eye and Isaac Grottle had been waiting. As soon as he saw them, Lurk had known the game was up. Under Nool's prodding, he had told them everything. He had explained that Thanquol had somehow learned of their schemes, leaving out only his part in their discovery, and he had told them, too, of the messages Thanquol had sent to their arch-enemies, the human Jaeger and the dwarf Gurnison. It went without saying that these lordly Skaven were outraged by what they saw as the Grey Seer's despicable treachery. He had sensed their murderous rage in the air, and done everything in his power to avoid being the focus of it. He had heard all about the gory details of Clan Scryer's excruciation engines, and many times he had shuddered at the tale of how Grottle liked to consume his enemies' entrails before their very eyes, while they still lived. In order to avoid this fate, he had racked his mind for every little detail he could remember, to convince them that he was cooperating thoroughly. The prospect of immediate painful death overcame any reluctance caused by the thought of what Grey Seer Thanquol might do to him in the future. And in one small, cunning, and deeply hidden part of Lurk's mind, it occurred to him that if these three could be made angry enough to take vengeance on Grey Seer Thanquol, then Thanquol would be too dead to take any revenge on him in turn. He was pretty sure now that he had succeeded. Heskett One-Eye had gnawed his own tail in rage, as Lurk explained how the Grey Seer had sent explicit details to their enemies concerning Clan Scryer's plan to invade the College of Engineering. He had even fabricated a few convincing details of how the Grey Seer had laughed and gloated about how his stupid enemies would soon fall into his trap. Well, thought Lurk, Thanquol most likely had. Isaac Grottle had become so outraged he even spluttered out a mouthful of food when Lurk explained how Thanquol had told him that the fat fool would never suspect his idiotic plan to smuggle a secret weapon into the city on a converted barge would be betrayed by Thanquol's cunning. Vilebroth Nool called down the curse of the horned rat on his rival when Lurk told him how Thanquol, jealous of the favour their god had shown the abbot, decided to remove a dangerous rival by revealing the whereabouts of his secret lair in the human cemetery to his two most trusty agents on the surface, Gurnison and Jaeger.
Are you certain the Grey Seer is in league with those two? Grottle demanded. Absolutely, definitely certain. Of course, mightiest of Moulders. He forced me on pain of hideous death to deliver notes to them, and they always responded to his instructions, did they not? I can only conclude that either they are in Grey Seer Thanquol's pay or... What?
Vilebroth Nool burbled.
No, the thought is too hideous. No true Skaven would stoop to... Stoop to what? To what? Oh, he is in their pay,
Lurk said, amazed by his own powers of invention. This set off another burst of outraged chittering.
No, impossible,
Heskett One-Eye said.
Thanquol is a Grey Seer. He would never submit to taking orders from any but another Skaven. The thought is ludicrous. And yet,
Vilebroth Nool said.
And yet,
Isaac Grottle said.
And yet it is indisputable that Gracia Thanquol had been in touch with the surface dwellers and had betrayed our plans to them,
Null said.
How else could they have got wind of our schemes? How else could such magnificently cunning plans have failed? Are you seriously suggesting that Gracia Thanquol is a traitor to the Skaven cause? Seriously?
Isaac Grottle asked, showing his terrifyingly huge fangs in a great snarl.
It's possible.
Lurk dared to add.
All too possible, I fear.
Heskett One Eye said.
It is the only explanation for why the Grey Seer would interfere with our mighty machinations, when all we were attempting to do was further the Skaven cause. And yet, the human and the dwarf are his enemies too. By all accounts, they almost killed him in the lair of the human von Hallstatt. And he sends the gutter runners against them.
Vilebroth Null added.
That was a true contract. Chang Squick still spits when he thinks of his failure. What if the Grey Seer Thanquol is cunning enough to use his enemies against us?
Heskett One Eye said excitedly.
He pits them against us. He cannot lose. He thwarts a rival, or we kill his sworn enemies for him.
There was a moment of silence in the chamber, and Lurk knew that whatever else his enemies thought of the Grey Seer, they had suddenly gained enormous respect for his cunning. On consideration, he had to admit that he had too. Whatever flaws he might possess, it was hard to dispute that Grey Seer Thanquol was possessed of all the qualities of a truly great Skaven.
Even so, even allowing that Grey Seer Thanquol possesses devilish cunning, he has still betrayed us to the enemy. That is beyond dispute. He has revealed our hidden plans, and the hidden plans of our great clans to the enemy,
Isaac Grottle said.
Grey Seer Thanquol is a traitor and an enemy of all our peoples. I agree,
Heskett said.
A traitor he most certainly is, and more. He is our personal enemy. He has acted against us all once and almost caused our deaths. Perhaps he will be more successful with his next attempt.
All three of them shivered when they thought of the demonically clever intelligence which worked against them. Lurk could see the fear written on their faces and in the nervous twitching of their whiskers.
I humbly suggest,
Null said,
that it might be the will of the Horned Rat that we remove Grey Seer Thanquol from his command of the army and send him to make his explanations to the Council of 13. I heartily agree with your sentiments. Heartily,
Isaac Grottle said.
But how are we to accomplish this? The traitor remains in command of almost 5,000 clan scab warriors, while our own forces are but a shadow of what they once were. Doubtless as the traitor planned,
Heskett said.
Doubtless,
the other two agreed simultaneously.
It is always assassination,
Heskett suggested.
Possibly, Grottle said. But who would take the chance that the Eshin might be deluded enough to report the request for such a thing to the traitor himself? Well, we could do it ourselves,
Vilebroth Null said.
Grey Seer Thanquol, despite his known treachery, he's a lamentably powerful sorcerer.
Heskett One Eye said.
We might fail, and we might die.
All three shuddered, and then, as one, all three pairs of eyes turned on Lurk. He quivered to the soles of his paws, for he knew what they were thinking.
No,
he said.
No,
Heskett One Eye said menacingly, reaching for the butt of his pistol.
No,
Isaac Grottle rumbled hungrily and licked his lips.
No,
Vilebroth Null said, hawking a huge lump of green phlegm onto the floor beside Lurk's feet, where it bubbled corruptly.
No, most merciful of masters. I am but a lowly Skaven. I possess not your mighty intellects and awesome powers. Any of you might expect to best Grey Seer Thanquol in combat or cunning, but not I. Then why should we preserve your life?
Isaac Grottle said silkily.
Why? Speak, quick, I'm hungry. Because
Lurk floundered around frantically, seeking a path out of this hideous maze. He cursed the day he had ever encountered Grey Seer Thankwall, or bore his messages to the human and the dwarf. Wait, that might be the answer. Perhaps in the Grey Seer's own great example was the solution to his problem.
Because there is a better way. Is there? Yes. One that holds fewer risks and is more certain. You interest me, Lurk Snitchtongue,
Isaac Grottle said.
What is there that you can see that we cannot? Yes, go on, explain,
Vilebroth Null said in his hideous bubbling voice.
You can use the Grey Seer's own methods against him. What? He has used Jaeger and Gurnison against you. Why not use them against him?
There was another pause while the three great Skaven exchanged glances.
They are certainly formidable,
Vilebroth Null said.
For non-Skaven. Perhaps they could do it,
chittered Heskett One Eye.
Do you think so? They are not Skaven, and Thankwall is a Grey Seer. A Grey Seer!
Isaac Grottle said, and banged his fist on the table for emphasis.
Let's see.
With every humble respect,
Vilebroth Null said.
You have not encountered this pair. Heskett is Scryer, and I have a more wicked and dangerous set of opponents. It is hard to imagine. Even I, with all my magical powers, barely eluded them. They slaughtered well over half my company,
Heskett said, leaving out his own part in the massacre.
I defer to your greater experience, Grottle said. But the question remains, how will we get them to go after Grey Seer Thankwall? Later,
Lurk suggested, carried away by the sheer pleasure of plotting.
Yes, later,
Vilebroth Null said.
It is fitting that Grey Seer Thankwall should be undone by the device by which he sought to undo us. But where and how will our two assassins get their chance at him? They must wait for the opportunity to arise,
Null said.
And how will we write this letter?
Grottle asked.
I, for one, have no knowledge of these primitive human runes. I have some knowledge of the human script,
Heskett One Eye said, almost apologetically.
I need it for reading human schematics. We must use the exact paper and pen that the Grey Seer uses,
Grottle said.
Our friend Lurk can acquire those,
Vilebroth Null said, smiling horribly to reveal rotting teeth.
He can deliver the message too, in his usual way,
Heskett said smugly.
It appears that I won't be eating you today, then, Lurk Snitchtongue,
Isaac Grottle said.
We need you alive. Of course, should you attempt to betray us... That will change,
Heskett finished. Lurk did not know whether to be glad or sorry. He appeared to have prolonged his life, but only at the risk of incurring Grey Seer Thankwall's wrath. How did he get himself into these things?
We're leaving the city,
Alyssa said challengingly. She glared up at Felix as if expecting him to contradict her.
Hans and I, we've decided to go.
I don't blame you, Felix said. It's a bad place to be, and it's going to get worse.
Is that all you have to say?
Felix looked around at the room they had shared during their brief time together. It seemed small and empty, and soon it would seem emptier still once she had gone. Was there anything more to say? He really could not blame her for wanting to leave, and to be honest, he could see no real future for them together. So why did it still hurt? Why did he have this feeling of hollowness within his chest? Why did he feel this urge to ask her to stay? "You're going with Hans?" he asked, just to hear some words. She looked at him coldly and crossed her arms together under her breasts defensively.
Yes,
she said.
You're not going to try and stop us, are you?
She seemed almost to want him to say yes, he thought. Well, it's not very safe outside the city right now, he said.
We're only going back to our village. It's less than a morning's walk.
Will they take you? I hear that people from the city are being stoned and shot with arrows if they go near villages and farms, in case they have the plague.
We'll survive, she said.
But she sounded less sure of herself.
Anyway, it can't be worse than it is here, with the plague and the gangs and the rats and all. At least back in the village they know us.
Well, they certainly know Hans. I thought you said the elders hated him.
You would cast that up, wouldn't you? They'll take us back. I'll tell them that we're going to be married. They'll understand.
Are you? Going to be married, I mean?
I suppose so.
You don't sound very enthusiastic.
Oh, Felix. What else am I supposed to do? Spend the rest of my life being pawed by strangers in bars? Going about with footloose mercenaries? It's not what I want. I want to go home.
You need any money? He asked. Suddenly she looked a little shifty.
No,
she said.
I'd best be going. Hans is waiting.
Be careful, he said, and meant it. It's not a safe city out there.
You should know,
she said. Suddenly she leaned forward and kissed him passionately on the mouth. Just as he was about to take her in his arms, she broke free and made for the door.
You look after yourself now,
she said, and he thought he detected a glimmer of tears in the corner of her eyes. Then she was gone. It was only afterwards, when he checked the loose floorboard, that he discovered the purse of money Otto had given him was gone. He lay on the bed, unsure whether to laugh or to cry. Well, he thought, let her have the money. The chances were he would not live long enough to spend it himself. Grazier Thankwall glanced around the chamber at the assembled Skaven captains. His burning gaze seemed to defy anyone to speak out. No one did. Lurk counted the commanders present. All of the clan's scab leaders were here, plus Isaac Grottle, Vilebroth Null, and Heskett One-Eye. Chang Squick, the Clan Eshin assassin, skulked in one corner, glaring occasionally at Lurk with hate-filled eyes.
Here we go.
He had not forgotten what Lurk had said about him on that long-ago day when the Grey Seer had humiliated them both in front of the whole army. The Grey Seer threw his arms wide. Trails of fire followed his paws as he gathered magical power. That got everyone in the room's attention, Lurk thought. Suddenly all eyes were riveted on Thankwall, as if with a single gesture he might choose to annihilate anyone who did not look at him. That was certainly a possibility, Lurk thought. If he recognized the signs correctly, the Grey Seer had consumed an awful lot of warpstone powder. Lurk shivered and continued to chew on the foul herbs that Vilebroth Null had given him to abate the plague. He fought down the urge to check within his breastplate and make sure the parchment and quill he had stolen from Thankwall's private stock were not sliding into view. He knew that nothing would draw attention to him quicker. He reassured himself that they were there. He could feel the nib of the pen poking into the tender fur beneath his armpit.
Tonight is the night you have all been waiting for,
Thankwall said.
Tonight we will smash-crash the humans once and for all. Tonight we will invade the city and enslave all the occupants. Tonight we will strike a blow for the Under-Empire and the Skaven nation. They will long be remembered.
Thankwall paused impressively and glanced around the room once more, as if waiting for an interruption. No one dared to speak, but Lurk saw Null, One-Eye, and Grottle exchange glances before looking at him. He hoped for all their sakes that the Grey Seer had not noticed. He glanced nervously at Thankwall, but fortunately the Grey Seer seemed to be caught up in the flow of his own mad eloquence.
We will grind the humans beneath the iron paw of our massed Skaven army. We will carry them off into inevitable slavery. Their wealth will be ours. Their city will be ours. Their souls will be offered screaming to the horned rat.
Thankwall paused once more, and Isaac Grottle found the courage to ask the question that Lurk could tell had been on everyone's mind.
And how is this to be accomplished, great leader? How? How indeed? By a plan at once simple and yet staggeringly cunning. By a use of force and sorcery, which will be talked about down the ages. By overwhelming ferocity and superior Skaven technology. By what precise means, Grey Seer Thankwall?
Vilebroth Null interrupted.
I humbly suggest that, like every Skaven out of Ranthood, we are all familiar with the general methods of attack.
For a moment, Lurk could tell that Thankwall was weighing up the pros and cons of blasting the Plague Monk into his component atoms for his insolence. He was glad when prudent Skaven caution won out, and the Grey Seer continued to speak.
I was just coming to that. As you would have discovered had you not interrupted me, we will attack through the sewers. Each of you will lead your assigned force to a point marked on the map.
With this, the Grey Seer indicated the complex mass of symbols inscribed on the large sheet of parchment hanging behind him. Many of the assembled leaders leaned forward to see where they would be sent.
I do not see your rune on this plan,
Heskett One-Eye said.
What will you be doing, Grey Seer?
Thankwall glared at him with burning red eyes.
I will be where you would expect your leader to be, performing the most difficult and dangerous of tasks.
Silence fell over the assembled Skaven leaders. This was not in point of fact where they would have expected their leader to be at all. They would expect him to be safely in the rear, directing operations. The warpstone Thankwall had consumed appeared to make him talkative. He spoke on into the silence.
I will be leading the crowning attack. I will lead the assault by our storm vermin, which will seize the palace of the breeder Emmanuel and capture all of the city's rulers. Tonight they are having a ball, one of their purposeless social events. I will fall on them by surprise and have them all in my paw. Leaderless, the humans will surely fall to our attack.
There were more murmurings from the assembled Skaven. It was a good plan, and a bold one. Lurk wondered if any of the others saw what he saw. The Grey Seer had chosen his place in the assault carefully. By managing this bold stroke, by capturing the human leaders, he would assure himself of the lion's share of the glory. Further, he would undoubtedly be a lot safer attacking a bunch of humans and their breeders dressed for a ball than fighting massed troops in the city.
Such a position is too dangerous for a leader of your great cunning,
Heskett One-Eye said.
It would be a tragedy if the genius of Thankwall was to be lost to Skavendom. To prevent such a tragedy, I will lead this assault. I will shoulder the terrible risks.
Lurk covered his mouth with a paw to prevent a snigger escaping. At least one other Skaven had realized what was going on.
No,
Isaac Grottle said.
I and my rat ogres are ideally suited for this task. We will overwhelm all...
Grottle's words were drowned out by the shouts of all the other Skaven volunteers. Thankwall let them call out for a few minutes before silencing them with a gesture.
Unfortunately, it will require my potent sorcery to effect entrance to the palace. I must be present.
Then I will gladly lay down my life to guard you, Isaac Grottle said, obviously determined to be present to share in the triumph.
And I...
Heskett One-Eye said. And I, shouted every other Skaven present, save Lurk.
No. I appreciate your concern, Brother Skaven, but your leadership will be required on other, no less critical parts of the battlefield.
It was obvious that Thankwall intended to share his glorious triumph with no one. The assembled war leaders subsided into disappointed chittering.
I have here a route map and a schedule for each of you, inscribed with precise instructions. All of you, that is, except for Lurk Snitchtongue. I would have a word with Lurk in private.
Lurk felt his heart start to race, and it was all he could do to prevent himself squirting the musk of fear. Had the Grey Seer found out about his plotting with the 3 clan representatives? Was he about to enact some terrible revenge? Was there any way Lurk could avoid this meeting? He turned desperate eyes on his 3 co-conspirators, and saw that they glared at him evilly. If looks could kill, Lurk knew, those 3 would have put him in a coffin. They feared he would betray them to save his own skin. And of course they were right. As the war leaders trooped forward one by one to receive the Grey Seer's blessing and their final instructions, Lurk prayed to the horned rat to preserve him. Felix wandered around until he arrived at his brother's townhouse. He was not surprised to see that it was locked and guarded. He was surprised to find that Otto and his wife had not fled the city, and furthermore, that the guards recognized him and allowed him to pass. Otto waited in his study to greet him. He was still working, inscribing things in his ledgers and writing dispatches that might never be received, intended for other branches of the Jaeger businesses. Felix was strangely proud of him at that moment. It took a great deal of courage to continue to work under these trying circumstances. "What can I do for you, Felix?" Otto asked without looking up. "Nothing. I just came by to see how you were."
Fine.
Otto gave a wan smile.
Business is booming.
"Is it?"
Of course not. Rats are eating the stock. The workers are stealing everything that isn't nailed down. The customers are dying of the plague.
"Why haven't you left town?"
Someone has to remain and look after our interests. This will all pass, you know. Disturbances always do. Then there'll be the business of rebuilding. Folk will need wool and timber and building materials. They'll need luxury goods to replace what's been looted. They'll need credit to buy it all. And when they do, Jaegers of Altdorf will still be here.
"I'll bet you will."
And what about you?
Otto asked, looking up at last. "I'm waiting to see the end of all this. I'm waiting for the Skaven to show themselves."
You think they will?
"I'm sure of it. I'm certain that this is all they're doing somehow."
How can you be so sure?
Felix looked at his brother long and hard. "Can you keep secrets?"
You know I can.
Felix decided that it was true. In his business, Otto would need a great deal of discretion. "What I'm going to tell you could get me hanged or burned at the stake."
What you and the dwarf did in Altdorf could get you that already. You're a long way from the capital, Felix, and I'm not going to turn you in.
Felix guessed that was true, and somehow he felt a need to tell someone exactly what had happened. So he told Otto the full tale of his encounters with the Skaven, from the first day in the sewer to the last battle on the barge. He omitted nothing, including his duel with von Hallstatt. Otto looked at him with an expression that went from incredulity to seriousness to finally belief.
You're not making this up, are you?
No.
You always did take those hero tales you read too seriously, little brother.
Felix smiled, and Otto smiled back. I did, didn't I?
What is it like, living in one?
Not what I expected. Not what I expected at all. Felix decided it was time to say what he had come to say. "Otto, I think you and your wife should leave the city. I think the Skaven are going to come soon, and that things will not be pleasant." Otto laughed.
We have armed servants, and this house is a fortress, Felix. We will be much safer here than in the country.
Felix knew his brother well enough to understand that there would be no persuading him. "You know your own business best," he said. Otto nodded.
Now, come eat, man. I can hear your stomach rumbling from here.
What is it, mightiest of mages? What do you require?
Lurk Snitchtongue bowed and scraped before Grey Seer Thankwall, searching for the words that would save him. He felt sure that the Grey Seer's supernatural powers had enabled him to see Lurk's treachery, and that now he was going to be punished. The terrible glow of Warpstone still filled Thankwall's eyes, and Lurk could almost sense the dark energies that seethed within him.
It concerns Vilebroth Null,
Grey Seer Thankwall said with an evil smile. Lurk felt his musk glands contract. He would have spoken then, but his tongue was tied. It felt like it had suddenly stuck to the roof of his mouth. All he could do was nod his head in a guilty fashion.
And Heskett One Eye,
Thankwall said, his malevolent grin stretching still further. A plea for mercy stuck in Lurk's throat. He tried to force it out, but it just would not come.
And Isaac Grottle,
Thankwall added. His burning eyes held Lurk pinned to the spot. The smaller Skaven felt like a bird, paralyzed before the gaze of a serpent. He nodded again and fell to his knees, paws clutched before him in a gesture of abasement.
Get up,
Thankwall said.
They're not so fearsome, no. Not at all. Now is the time to be rid of them once and for all, and you will help me do it.
Get rid of them, mightiest of masters?
Yes. Did you see the way they questioned me when I was giving orders to the army? Did you see the way they tried to steal the glory from my brilliant plan? My mind is made up.
I will tolerate them no longer. This night they will die. How? How, Lord of Seers? Will you blast them with magic? No, idiot. My hands must remain clean. No. We will use the tried and tested method. I will inform my two pawns of their whereabouts. This evening when the battle comes, my enemies will meet with the dwarf's axe. Then, hopefully, the rest of their force will bring down that interfering twosome. How will you engineer this, cleverest of conspirators? I have assigned all three to one strike group. Its place of emergence is very close to the burrow where Jaeger and Gurnison and a horde of mercenaries dwell. You are also assigned to that group. You will go through first, on pretext of scouting, and you will warn that horrid pair of what is about to occur. Oh, yes, yes. Consider it done, most supreme of schemers. Take this message and see that it is delivered. Then flee to my presence, and I will see that you are suitably rewarded for your loyalty.
Lurk did not like the emphasis the Grey Seer put on that last phrase at all, but he took the letter and, still bowing, backed from Thanquol's presence. Felix rang Drexler's doorbell more from hope than any real belief that the doctor would be there, so he was pleasantly surprised when the viewing slot was opened and a servant peered out.
"Oh, it's you, Herr Jaeger," he said. "Are you alone?"
"Yes, and I would speak with your master."
"Best come in, then."
Felix heard bolts being thrown and the door creak open. He glanced back over his shoulder to make sure that no bandits were poised to take advantage of the situation, then hurried through. The servant slammed the door behind him. Felix strode through the corridors of the doctor's mansion. It felt like years since he had first come here with Alyssa, though in fact it had only been weeks. How had things changed so quickly, he asked himself, suppressing a flash of loneliness and sadness at the thought the woman was gone. He shook his head and smiled sadly, knowing that her departure was one of the reasons why he was here. He was just moving around to keep himself busy and avoid thinking about things. The servant showed him into Drexler's study. The doctor sat by his fire looking drained and weary. Weeks of treating plague victims had obviously taken something out of him. There were lines on his face that had not been there when Felix had last seen him, and a hint of pallor beneath his tan.
Herr Jaeger, what can I do for you?
"I've brought back your book," Felix said, producing the doctor's copy of Lieber's work. "I would have returned it sooner, but I've been very busy." The doctor smiled wanly.
"So, Herr Ostwald has told me. It seems Aldred chose a worthy successor for ownership of his blade."
"I'm not so convinced," Felix said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the city. "All of my and Gottrek's efforts seem to have come to naught."
"And do not be sure of that, Herr Jaeger. What man can tell of all the consequences of his actions? It may be that things would be a lot worse without your intervention."
"I wish I could believe that, but I do not think it is so."
"Only Sigmar can judge a man's actions, Herr Jaeger, and I believe that in some ways he smiles upon you and your friend. You are still here, aren't you? How many others would be able to say the same if they had undergone your adventures? I know I could not."
Felix looked at him, struck by the fact that there was some truth in the man's words. "You're a good doctor, Herr Drexler. I feel better just talking to you."
"Perhaps you should wait until you see my bill before you thank me," Drexler said.
His smile showed that he was joking.
"You found what you wanted in the book?"
Felix set it down on the table. "More than I ever wanted. I'm not sure that it helps, knowing how evil and depraved the rat men are."
"Again, Herr Jaeger, who knows what knowledge might prove useful? Have some food. I have managed to preserve something from the afflictions of our city."
Felix thought guiltily of the meal which he had already eaten at Otto's. His stomach felt full, but, well, on the other hand, he had no idea when he might eat again. If Gottrek's theory about the Skaven's imminent onslaught was going to be correct, he was going to need all his strength. "Why not?" he said. Maybe the last meal I get. Why do you say that? Drexler asked. And Felix decided that now was the time to deliver his warning. Because I believe that the Skaven will attack the city soon. I also think that you should leave. I say this as a friend. I thank you for the warning, Herr Jaeger, but I cannot go today. You see, tonight I am attending a ball at the palace in the presence of Elector Countess Emmanuel herself. Somehow the thought sent a shiver running down Felix's spine. Lurk knew it was going to be bad when he felt the heavy hand of one of Isaac Grottel's troops on his shoulder, and he was hustled unceremoniously into the fat Skaven's palanquin. He found himself looking up into the folds of flesh beneath the chin of the gigantic Moulder Packmaster. Grottel's huge belly virtually pressed him back against the cushions of the palanquin with a life of its own.
Now, where are you going?
Isaac Grottel asked.
Where indeed?
Lurk thought fast. He did not like the hungry gleam that had appeared in the Packmaster's eye. He thought of the letter that he bore for the Grey Seer. He thought of the disease that threatened to fill his lungs with pus, unless the abbot continued to intervene on his behalf with the horned rat.
I was just on my way to see you, most majestic of Moulders. Then it is fortunate I have found you. Tell me, what is it that you are carrying?
Lurk told him everything. He'd expected Isaac Grottel to reach out with one podgy hand and snap his neck, but the Packmaster merely laughed a rich, booming laugh.
It would appear the Grey Seer has been too clever for his own good. You will deliver your message, but it will be one I shall dictate, and Hesketh one I shall write down. As you wish, most potent of all Packmasters.
Felix trudged back towards the blind pig, feeling almost too full to move. Over the past few weeks his stomach had shrunk, and what once might have been a normal meal now left him feeling bloated. 2 such meals in one day made him feel like he was going to explode. He wore a new herbal talisman, given to him by the doctor, and he carried another within his pouch for Gotrek. It was a slight reassurance to him. So far he had not caught the plague, but that might not signify anything. Nobody else he knew had either. Perhaps it was mere chance that had spared them, or perhaps it was the fact that Heinz insisted they kill every last rat they spotted around the pig. Felix could not even begin to guess. He only knew that he was grateful to Drexler for the gift. He looked around into the gathering gloom and shivered. The city looked like a mere ghost of the thriving metropolis it had been when he and Gotrek first arrived. Many buildings had burned down. More were empty. No lights shone in most of the tenements. The bustling life of the streets had been replaced by an aura of fear. The only ones likely to be abroad now were predators and their victims. He felt the flesh crawl between his shoulder blades and was suddenly convinced that someone was watching him. He turned his head to look at the mouth of a nearby alley. The whoosh of air alerted him too late. Something hit him on the skull. He shook his head in response, half expecting a surge of pain. None came. He raised his fingers to his brow, but felt no blood. He looked down to see what had hit him, and saw that it was a rolled-up piece of parchment, similar to all the others which had borne a warning concerning the Skaven. He bent down to pick it up and glanced round at the same time. He heard the sound of scuttling down a nearby alley, and realized that it was most likely whoever had thrown the paper. Without thinking, Felix scooped up the parchment and raced off in pursuit. He stretched his long legs to the maximum as he ran down the alley. Ahead of him, he thought he caught sight of a cowled figure. Was it possible that that was a long, rodent-like tail protruding out from under that monkish robe? All too possible, he decided. The figure had reached the end of the alley and turned hastily down another of the winding maze of streets. Felix raced past open doorways, scattering amazed-looking beggars and treading monstrous rats underfoot as he raced onwards. His heartbeat sounded loud in his chest, and sweat poured down his face. He felt nauseous, and wished that he had not eaten quite so much at Dr. Drexler's, particularly after the heavy meal at his brother's. He clutched the scroll tight in one hand, and restrained the scabbard flapping on his belt with the other. "Stop, Skaven!" he shouted. His words had no effect on the fleeing Ratman. All the beggars leapt for cover within the nearest door. Felix raced on. Why am I doing this? He asked himself. As far as he knew, the Skaven ahead had done them nothing but favours by warning him of his brethren's plans. In that case, why was he fleeing? Felix asked himself. But he already had an answer. Who could tell why the Ratmen did anything? Who could guess at the reasons of a creature that was not even human? Felix's heart leapt as he saw the Ratman trip and fall. Perhaps he could overhaul it after all. Caught up in the fury of the chase, he desperately wanted to do so. He wanted to grab the Ratman and look into its eyes and question it. Not, he thought, that it would likely understand the human tongue. According to Liber, the Ratmen had their own languages, including a number of specialized dialects used by the various clans. Still, at least this one knew enough Reichspiel to write its notes, Felix thought, so perhaps it could be interrogated. He ran faster, hope blazing in his breast that at last he might be able to get some answers to his questions about the Skaven. Lurk glanced back over his shoulder and chittered a curse. It was no use. That foolish human was still following him. Why? What did it hope to achieve by persecuting him in this way? Why could it not leave him alone and read the message that Heskett One-Eye had inscribed on the parchment? If it did that, it would surely realize that it had more urgent business this night, like heading to the palace and thwarting Grey Seer Thanquol's plan. Life was so unfair, Lurk thought unhappily. Here he was, in poor health, browbeaten by some of the most ferocious Skaven who ever lived, about to make an enemy of one of the mightiest sorcerers of his race. His head hurt. His eyes burned with fever. His heart felt like it was going to give out from the strain of this race. His lungs felt like they were on fire. And where was he? Not in some comfortable burrow back in Skavenblight, but being pursued through the horribly open streets of this human city by a large and terrifying warrior. It was like some dreadful nightmare. The sheer unfairness of it all galled Lurk. What had he ever done to deserve this? He shot another backward glance and saw that his pursuer was starting to narrow the distance that separated them. Lurk prayed that night would come, or that mist would arise. He felt certain that in darkness and shadow he could lose the human, or if he could just reach the hidden entrance to the sewers where the bulk of the invasion force waited, he would find safety. He risked another look back, and cursed as he felt his feet go out from beneath him. He knew he should have looked where he was going. Felix closed the gap quickly as he saw the Skaven scrabble to its feet. He wondered briefly whether he should pause and draw his sword. He decided against it. He would lose ground again, and the Skaven did not appear to be armed. He could always produce his blade when he had the Ratman cornered. Breathing heavily, he ran on.
This is killing my computer. I need to get a new one so freaking bad.
Praise the horned rat, thought Lurk. Ahead of him he could see the opening into the sewers. He knew that he merely had to leap down it, and he would be safe in the comforting bosom of the Skaven army. Down there waited Vilebroth Null, Isaac Grottle, Heskett One-Eye, and all their soldiers. But as he gathered his legs beneath him in preparation for the mighty leap that would carry him to safety, he felt a powerful hand clamp onto his shoulder. Felix felt the Skaven stiffen as he grabbed it. He pulled hard, spinning it around, and almost let go as the wicked-looking creature glared up at him with hate-filled eyes. Of all the Ratmen he had ever encountered, this was the most sly and nasty-looking. It was smaller and thinner than most, but had a wiry strength that made it difficult to hold. "Now," Felix panted, "tell me what you're doing here." A sudden pain flared in his left wrist as the Ratman bit it. Overcome by shock, Felix let go. Lurk broke free from his tormentor's grip and dropped gratefully into the sewer. Breaking the surface, he looked around and saw that the Skaven assault force had already gathered. A horde of Ratmen waited in attendance. He looked around and saw Isaac Grottle.
Alright, where were we?
On the others waiting in the leader's position at the rear. A storm vermin claw leader looked down at Lurk as he pulled himself out of the filth and shook his fur clean.
What is it?
The claw leader asked.
I am pursued.
Lurk gasped without thinking. Before he could expand on his statement, the claw leader reacted, keen to grab some glory.
Right!
The Skaven shouted.
Quick, quick! Charge!
Felix inspected his bitten wrist. It did not look too bad, he thought. Then he glanced up in horror as he heard the first of the rat men begin to swarm up the sewer access ladder. Only moments before, he had debated whether to pursue the escaping Skaven into the sewers. Now he saw that it would have been suicidal. Already the leering face and snapping jaws of a burly, black-armoured rat man had emerged into the gloom. Felix wasted no time. He launched a hefty kick that sent the furiously squeaking Skaven tumbling back down among his fellows, and then turned and ran. Moments later, a mass of furiously chittering Skaven warriors emerged into the alley. Somewhat ahead of schedule, the great invasion of Nuln had begun.
No! No!
Lurk squeaked as the tightly packed mass of Skaven warriors surged past him. The press of furry bodies pushed him back into the foul waters of the sewer. For a horrible moment, he felt like he was going to drown, but then he broke the surface once more, just in time to see the last of the storm vermin clambering with unrestrained fury into the light. Above him, the mad face of Vilebroth Nul leered down.
Did you deliver the message?
Burbled the low abbot of the plague monks.
Yes, yes.
Lurk chittered, thinking that now was possibly not the best time to tell Nul that the Skaven troops above were now doing their best to hunt down and kill the man to whom the message had been delivered. Felix could hear the shouts of his foul pursuers behind him, and the screams of the unfortunates who got in their way. A quick glance over his shoulder revealed that the Skaven were putting anyone in their path to the sword. The sight of it sickened Felix, but in a way he was also glad. Every little pause and hesitation enabled him to increase his lead over them. His wrist throbbed where the little Skaven had bitten it. He noticed that the scroll it had thrown at him was crumpled in his hand. Briefly he toyed with throwing it away. Instead, he thrust it inside his tunic and continued to sprint. At least he was not weighed down with heavy armour the way his pursuers were. The thought trickled slowly into his mind that the Skaven invasion must have started. The sight of so many heavily armed rat men in the streets could only mean that they were ready to begin an all-out attack on the city, and that they had no fear of the defenders. Right now, Felix guessed, their confidence was justified. He could not see a single member of the city guard. Of course, most of them were probably up in the noble quarter around the palace, making sure all the guests at the Countess's party were safe. Felix slammed into a wall and rebounded again, turning quickly to hurtle down a connecting alley. This area of narrow lanes and alleys was a veritable maze, and he was not at all sure he was heading in the right direction. He could only move as quickly as possible and listen to the noise of his pursuers, praying that he did not blunder round in a complete circle and run right into them again. He searched his brain for a plan, but all he could come up with was to get back to the Blind Pig as quickly as possible and warn Gotrek and the others. At least there was a strong force of mercenaries and a potential rallying point for any human warriors. Now all he had to do was find a way out. His heart filled with fear. He continued to run. Lurk tried to keep himself right in the middle of the teeming mass of warriors. He had endured enough excitement for one evening and did not need any more. He focused his attention on keeping Isaac Grottle in sight. The Moulder Packmaster's bodyguard of huge rat ogres represented his best hope of protection in the coming conflict. Lurk seriously doubted that anyone would want to attack the huge creatures. So far, the assault appeared to be going well. The Skaven force in this area had met with little resistance. He could smell burning and the distinctive oil and naphtha smell of warp fire throwers. From the backwash of light off to the south, he realized that some of the clan Scryer warp fire throwers were using their weapons on the buildings. Squinting through the shadows, Lurk could see jets of flame squirting out at the tenements. Fire licked and curled at the woodwork. Stone began to splinter and crack under the sheer heat generated by the awesome Skaven weapons. Lurk was not so certain that this was a good idea. He was not sure Grey Seer Thanquol would approve of such indiscriminate destruction of his future property. Of course, if the message Lurk had delivered achieved its goal, the Grey Seer would be in no position to voice his objections. he would be dead. Lurk wondered whether the human Jaeger had managed to escape. Part of him hoped not. He could still remember the wretched human's hand clamped on his shoulder, and the pain where the iron fingers had bit into his fur. There was no sign that he had been taken prisoner, nor any sign of his corpse. Not that that meant anything, Lurk thought. In these winding alleys, already crammed with Skaven victims, a body could be lying almost anywhere. Already the Skaven force had started to break up and fan out. Some of the warriors, meeting little resistance, had already begun looting and eating. Lurk was not sure that this was a good idea either. Surely things could not go so easily. Surely they would meet more resistance than this. Where were the accursed human warriors? His questions received no answers. All around, buildings were beginning to burn. Chang Squick clambered up the sheer face of the cliff, leading to the palace of the human breeder Emmanuel. The line attached to his grapnel held firm. The heavy weight of the rune-encrusted seeing stone, entrusted to him by Grey Seer Thanquol personally, rested securely in the knapsack on his back. Chang Squick braced himself and scrabbled with the claws of his feet for purchase on the smooth stone of the cliff face. Things were going well. In a few more minutes, he would be in position with the stone placed within the halls of the palace, ready for whatever mighty magic the Grey Seer had planned. He would have played his part in the Skaven victory today, and gone some way towards mitigating the disgrace of his failure to kill the dwarf and his human henchmen. Hopefully, that painful memory was something which could be laid to rest before this night was over too. Suddenly below him in the distance, he heard the faint but distinct chittering of Skaven war cries, and the answering screams of their human victims. Twisting on the rope, he glanced back and saw the eerie glow of what could only be warp fire throwers being used in the distance. Surely the attack had not begun already. The fools were supposed to wait until he was within the palace, and Grey Seer Thanquol's plan had been implemented. He cursed and redoubled his efforts to climb. The noise and the sight of the fire would draw human sentries and other spectators to the battlements above him. Chang Squick could ill afford to have his grapnel line discovered. All it would take would be one human with a knife to slice the black rope, and his long and honourable career would come to an end. Controlling his urge to squirt the musk of fear, the Clan Eshin assassin pulled himself upward. The strange greenish light in the sky confirmed Felix's suspicions that the invasion had indeed begun. He recognized the color of the flames as being the same as those produced by the strange weapons which had destroyed the College of Engineering. Looking back, he could see fire leaping from the rooftops of blazing tenements. The college had been a separate building, isolated behind the walls of its own grounds. The buildings here, in this part of the city, in contrast, were packed as tight together as drunks in a crowded tavern. Many of them leaned conspiratorially over alleyways. Some were linked by high bridges far above the ground and by supporting arches in the alleys. Most had thatched roofs and wooden support beams. Felix shivered in spite of himself. The conflagration was going to spread quickly. The city was going to burn. Still, at least for the moment, he seemed to have lost his pursuers. There was not a rat-man in sight. Better yet, he recognized this street at last, and knew that he was not too far from the Blind Pig. He paused, leaning forward with his hands braced on his knees, panting for breath and shaking his head to clear the sweat from his eyes. Once he reached the tavern, he would be able to put together a plan with Gotrek and the others. Suddenly, from the mouth of a nearby alley, he heard a shrieked war cry. Looking up, he saw a large group of Skaven erupt out into the cobbled street. Gathering all his energy, Felix ran for his life. Grey Seer Thanquol led his elite force of storm vermin into position. His keen Grey Seer's intuition told him that directly above them was the palace. He could sense its presence. He trampled the corpse of the sewer watchman beneath his paw and allowed himself to gloat. So far, the Clan Eshin assassins had done their work. Every human in the sewers who might have given away their presence was dead. By now, teams of gutter runners would be in position at the base of the cliff on which the castle rested. Hopefully, by now, Chang Squick would be in position. Thanquol produced the scrying stone from within his robes. He began to mutter the incantations which would link it to the twin carried by the leader of the Eshin forces. Now would be the time for a mighty feat of sorcery, one that would grant the Skaven swift and inevitable victory. In order to perform it, Thankwall knew he would need vast amounts of power, and therein lay the danger. In order to acquire enough mystical energy to power the spells that he needed to perform, Thankwall would have to consume an enormous amount of warpstone, and that had its dangers. This was not the mild, refined stuff which made up his snuff. No. This was the pure product, the very essence of magic, concentrated and purified by Skaven alchemists. It was a substance capable of providing its user with awesome power, but its use carried equally awesome dangers. Many Grey Seers had been driven over the edge into madness by the corrosive effects of the substance on their sanity. Others had been reduced to mindless chaos spawn by its mutating effects. Taken in large enough doses by those of insufficiently strong will, warpstone could devolve its user into a formless, amorphous thing. But what was that to him, mightiest of Grey Seers? Thankwall was a practiced user of warpstone, was capable of consuming it in gigantic quantities without ill effect. The things that happened to all those others could not happen to him. Definitely. Positively not. For a moment, brief niggling doubt fled in Thankwall's mind. What if there was something wrong with the warpstone? What if it were not pure, but contaminated with other stuff? Such things had happened. What if Thankwall were not as strong as he believed? Mistakes in dosage were always possible. But only for a second did the Grey Seer hesitate, before his natural confidence in his own mighty abilities returned. He was not one to flinch from the dangers of warpstone. In fact, he admitted to himself, he rather enjoyed it. He reminded himself of this as he reached into his pouch and put the first luminous piece of warpstone onto his tongue. It tingled even as he consumed it. Now memories of his long-gone youth came back to him. He recalled his initiation into the use of warpstone. No, thought Thankwall. There was nothing to fear here. So thinking, he began preparing himself, making himself ready for when the correct time came to cast the spell which would grant his forces victory. Ahead, Felix could see the lights of the Blind Pig. A wave of relief passed through him. If the tavern did not quite represent safety, at least it had to be better than this nightmare chase through the darkened streets with a horde of shrieking ratmen on his trail. He could see Boris and Stefan and a host of their companions standing in the street, shielding their eyes as they studied the distant fires. "Beware! Skaven!" Felix shouted, and saw them all reach for their weapons. In moments, swords glittered in the half-light of the burning city. From inside the tavern, a number of armoured figures spilled out into the gloom. Felix was relieved to see the massive squat figure of Gotrek among them. There was something enormously reassuring under these circumstances about the massive axe clutched in his hands. Felix raced up to the warriors as they braced themselves for the Skaven attack. Behind him, the Skaven, unwilling or unable to give up the heady rush of the chase, came on like an avalanche of fur and fury. Felix made his way through the throng to stand beside Gotrek. The Slayer had the usual look of mad joy in his one good eye that he always got before combat.
"I see you found us, scuttling little friends, Manling,"
he said, running his thumb along the blade of his axe until a bright red bead of blood appeared. "Yes," Felix gasped, struggling to get his breath back before the combat began.
"Good. Let's get killing, then."
Dr. Drexler looked around him. Something was very wrong. Many of the warriors had gone to the battlements to look at the fires and not come back. Ostwald had already herded the women back into the ballroom. Messengers had been rushing to and fro between Ostwald, Countess Emmanuel, and those outside. Something was very definitely happening, and he needed to find out what it was. If he had not known better, he would have sworn that Ostwald had ordered the orchestra to play louder to drown out the sounds of the disturbance. That must be it, Drexler thought, knowing that he had guessed the truth. Something was happening, and in order to forestall a panic, Hieronymus was covering it up. He glanced around at the others present and adjusted his mask. Most of the people in the
Something's
ballroom
wrong.
consisted of ladies of rank, together with a sprinkling of hangers-on, toadies, and those simply too drunk to leave the hall. Of course, there were footmen present, and a few guards too, but the situation was not very reassuring. He glanced across at Ostwald, not wanting to divulge the connection between them, but filled with curiosity about what was going on. The secretary was garbed as a wood elf warrior, complete with bow. Drexler walked up to him, still nibbling at a savoury.
What has happened?
He asked.
Some disturbance in the town, Herr Doctor. Arson, and possibly worse. With Her Serenity's permission, I have ordered troops from the barracks to quell the problem.
Nothing wrong in the palace, then?
Not as far as I know, but I have ordered the guards to double-check.
Let us pray to Sigmar that it is only some looters. Things have been dreadful recently.
I fear the worst,
Ostwald said, looking up as another courier approached. Drexler agreed. Somewhere nearby, his sorcerously trained senses told him that powerful magic was gathering. Chang Squick cursed and ducked for cover. The place smelled like a reeking midden. Looking around with his dark, accustomed eyes, he could tell this was, in truth, a human privy. Well, there were worse places to hide, he told himself, but this was not going to help his mission. He knew it was no use. He was not going to make it to the great chamber above the ballroom that he and the Grey Seer had agreed on. All of the stolen maps of the palace he had studied and still carried in his head told him this. He just did not have the time to get there, and even with his supreme skills at sneaking and skulking, he doubted that he could find his way, unseen, through the mass of humans crowding the palace corridors and heading to the battlements in search of a view of what was going on below. This place was just going to have to do. He took the knapsack from his back and reached within. The heat and the glow produced by the seeing stone told him that he was only just in time, perhaps even a little late. He wondered how long the Grey Seer had already spent glaring out into the darkness of the inside of his pack. He shuddered when he thought of the wrath of Thankwall, as he squatted down, pressed his nose to the side of the stone, and gave the thumbs-up sign. Felix ducked the swipe of a jagged scimitar and lashed out with his sword. His blow took the Skaven beneath the ribs and cleaved upwards in search of its heart. The Skaven gave an eerie, high-pitched shriek, clutched its chest, and died. It fell to the ground even as Felix withdrew his blade from its chest. Felix glanced around at the swirling melee. To his right he saw Heinz dash out the brains of a Skaven leader with the kosh he held in his left hand, while he fended off the attack of another Skaven with the blade he held in his right. Boris and Stefan fought back to back in the teeth of the tide of ratmen. Somewhere in the distance he could hear Gottrek's bellowed war cry. Right at this moment, it was difficult to tell how the fight was going.
See,
the mercenaries seemed to be holding their own against the Skaven, and the battle seemed to have attracted the attention of others. Humans were pouring out of the nearby tenements. Some clutched bedpans and pokers and other improvised weapons. Others carried swords and blunderbusses and other, rather more useful-looking instruments of destruction. It seemed that the citizens had decided that they would rather meet their end in battle with their foes than be burned to death in their homes. That was good, thought Felix, for the mercenaries needed all the help they could get, as more and more Skaven were being drawn through the blazing streets to the sound of battle. Even as he stood there, a severed head came flying out of the gloom, spinning, spilling blood from disconnected arteries, spraying all those below it with a shower of black raindrops. It arced straight toward Felix, and he batted it aside with his sword. Salty black fluid splattered his face, and he fought the urge to lick his lips to clean them. Looking down, he saw that the head belonged to a huge Skaven warrior. He wiped his face with his cloak quickly, worried that something might take advantage of his blindness and stab him. Shaking his head, he moved forward cautiously to where he could hear Gottrek shouting. Ahead of him, he could see an enormous ruck. The Slayer stood poised atop what first Felix took to be an enormous mound of bodies, but swiftly realized was a plague cart. A wave of furious Skaven scrabbled to reach him, but were being hewn down by the awesome power of the Slayer's axe. In the distance, looming over the great mass of lesser Skaven, Felix could see a huge wedge of creatures he had come to think of as rat ogres. Gottrek obviously saw them too, for he dived from the top of the plague cart into the seething sea of Skaven. Within moments, his flickering axe had left a wall of broken and dying bodies all around him, as he thrust his way towards the giant monsters that were his goal. Felix debated for only a moment whether to follow him, and then pushed forward, shouting, "Follow me, lads! Let's kill some bloody ratmen!" As he hacked to left and right, he hoped the mercenaries were listening and following. Otherwise, he and Gottrek were in for a hard time when they closed with the rat ogres. Thankwall glared into his scrying crystal. His head swam. His brain felt aflame. The power of the warpstone flowed through his veins like a drug. It made him feel dizzy and wonderful at the same time. At this moment, he felt sure he could perceive the underlying pattern of mystical forces focused on the crystal. He concentrated harder on making the thing work. At last, the darkness had cleared. At last, he could see the leering face of Chang Squick. It appeared that the Clan Eshin assassin had reached his objective. Good, Thankwell thought. About time. He could barely contain the enormous mass of warpstone-fueled mystical energy which boiled within him. He felt so saturated with power that it seemed that at any minute he might explode. His head swam and his vision blurred. Everything seemed to swim around him. Frantically, he tried to remember the syllables of the spell he had memorized so long ago in that great black book in the accursed library. For a long moment the words eluded him, squirming and sliding just out of reach of his thought processes. Thankwell bit the insides of his cheek until he tasted blood. The pain seemed to sharpen his wits, for eventually the words came to him. He opened his lips, and the syllables of his ancient language seemed to vomit forth from his mouth, ejecting with them a roiling cloud of dark, magical energy. Thankwell's heartbeat accelerated to levels he would not have believed were endurable. His heart thumped wildly in his chest, and his breathing was ragged and choked. He knew he was losing control of his spell, and fought to rein in the flow of power before it destroyed him. Brain-blasting visions danced through his mind, and he knew that his seer's gifts had been driven to incredible new heights by the unprecedented amounts of warpstone he had consumed. Briefly, his consciousness seemed to leave his body, and scenes flickered through his mind in swift succession. For a moment his spirit hovered over the city, and he had a panoramic view of all that was happening. Below him the streets blazed with fire and violence. A river of Skaven raced through the city, killing all that were in their path. Here and there they had encountered pockets of armed resistance, where human garrisons, or just the mobs of citizens, had taken to the streets in defense of their homes. He saw swift, savage scuffles and giant rats devouring the corpses of man and Skaven alike. He saw burning buildings and broken bodies. He saw the whole of the great ancient man-city of Nuln in flames. Thankwell's attention was drawn to one particular struggle, which suddenly leapt into focus when he recognized two alarmingly familiar figures. The dwarf and the human, followed by a disciplined pack of human warriors, were hacking through the Skaven warriors towards the hulking bodyguard of Isaac Grottle. In his trance state, Thankwell could see the roaring rat ogres, and the appalled look on the face of his henchling Lurk as he contemplated the prospect of imminent violence. He saw the mad eyes of Vilebroth Nul glaring into space, as if he sensed the presence of some disembodied watcher. It looked very much to the Grey Seer like his plan was working, and the interfering twosome were about to destroy his bitterest rivals. Good, he thought. Let them. Thankwell would brook no others claiming an unfair portion of his glory. He saw Heskett One-Eye bark instructions to his Jezzael-equipped bodyguards, and saw the long-barreled rifle swing to bear on the dwarf. No, Thankwell thought furiously. None of that. With an almost imperceptible flicker of his thoughts, he touched the sniper's mind. Its fingers curled on the trigger, but its warpstone bullet went wild, smashing into the skull of a rat ogre, almost killing the brainless beast. The thing roared and went wild, surging forward into the Skaven troops from the rear, killing as it went. Thankwell felt dizzy, and realized that he was losing himself in his spell. His power was bleeding away, and if he intended to accomplish what he wanted, he had better do it soon. With a wrench, he sent his spirit soaring back towards the castle. He funneled it into the link with the scrying stone, and looked out once more on Chang Squick. Suddenly, with a snap, he was back in his own body again, and the words of the spell were tumbling from his mouth. He concentrated with all his might, bringing to bear all the relentless discipline of his many years as a Grey Seer, and the spells swiftly returned to his control. In the air before him, the dark cloud shimmered and parted, revealing a rift in space running from the point just in front of where Thankwell stood to the ground around Chang Squick's scrying crystal. Quick, forward! He shouted to his storm-vermin guard. They walked forward into the black cloud, shimmered and vanished, to reappear, Thankwell most earnestly hoped, in the very heart of the Breeder Emmanuel's palace. Ahead of them, Felix could see the rat ogres. They loomed head and shoulders above the crowd, monstrous creatures, man-shaped, but with the heads of immense rabid rats. Vast boils erupted through their mangy fur. The stigmata of a variety of foul mutations marred their flesh. Each had paws the size of shovels, which ended in claws like daggers. Huge tusk-like fangs, dripping with saliva, filled their mouths. Their bellows were audible even over the din of battle. At the sight of them, Felix felt the urge to halt and flee. He could tell the mercenaries following him felt the same way. The momentum of their charge was dissipating as they contemplated the horrific appearance of their foes. Only Gotrek showed no fear. He ploughed onward, unwilling or unable to be bothered by the fearsome nature of his foes. The rat ogres were no more troubled by the troll slayer's arrival than he was by theirs. With an ear-shattering roar, they charged rapidly to meet him. It seemed unlikely to Felix that anything could survive the mad rush of such huge creatures. It was like expecting someone to be able to withstand the charge of a herd of elephants. Nothing should have been able to withstand the onslaught of that huge mass of muscle and teeth and claws. For a moment, all heads turned, and even the Skavens stopped their relentless advance to watch. Completely undaunted by the fact his opponents were twice his size, Gotrek came on. His axe flashed, glowing red in the lurid blaze of the burning buildings, and one of the rat ogres tumbled backwards, its leg chopped off at the knee. As it fell, the slayer's axe slashed back again and severed its arm. Clutching at the bloody stump with its good paw, the creature rolled over on the ground, writhing and shrieking. Another of the immense creatures reached out and made a grab for the dwarf. Its razor-like talons bit into his ruddy flesh. Bloody droplets appeared on Gotrek's shoulder as the mighty beast raised him high above its head. It opened its huge jaws to the fullest extension, as if intending to drop the slayer in and devour him in one bite. Gotrek brought his axe crashing down. Powered by all the awesome strength of the slayer's mighty arm, it smashed the rat ogre's head in two. Blood, brains, and teeth exploded everywhere. The slayer went flying backwards through the air, propelled skyward by the reflex action of the rat ogre's death spasm. Seeing the remaining rat ogres begin their advance towards Gotrek's recumbent form, Felix mustered all his courage and shouted, "Charge! Charge! Let's send these foul vermin back to the hell that spawned them!" Not daring to look back over his shoulder to see if anyone was following him, he raced forward into the fray. Chang Squick watched in amazement as the air in front of him shimmered. For a moment it appeared like a small bright hole had been punched in the very fabric of the world. Through that hole leaked a vile black gas which smelled of warpstone and dark magic. Even as the assassin watched, the cloud expanded and shimmered until it stood higher than any Skaven. Then the cloud itself parted to reveal a gateway, joining the privy in which Chang Squick stood to the place where the Grey Seer was. Chang Squick heard a sudden noise behind him and span around to see an ornately garbed human enter the privy, fumbling with his codpiece as if he intended to make water. The human reeked of alcohol. He paused in amazement and looked at the skulking Skaven, then shook his head as if to clear it.
"I say," he said, "that's a ruddy good costume."
Then his eyes widened further as he noticed the ranks of storm vermin starting to pour through Thanquol's sorcerous gateway. He opened his mouth and had just time for one shriek of warning before Chang Squick's throwing knife buried itself in his heart. More and more Skaven warriors flowed into the chamber, bursting out from the privy and into the corridors of the palace. Felix ducked, threw himself flat, and rolled under a blow that would have taken his head off had it connected. Up close, the rat ogres were, if anything, even more frightening to behold. Their muscles were like the cables used to moor ships, and they looked as if they could smash through a stone wall with little effort. The creature's massive tail lashed through the air with a crack like a whip. Worse yet was the smell, an awful combination of animal reek, wet fur, and warpstone. It reminded Felix of old and very sour cheese, but was infinitely stronger, and threatened to bring tears to his eyes.
Gross.
He rolled to one side as a fist the size of his head smashed into the ground where he had been. He kicked out at the rat ogre's leg, hoping to unbalance it, but he might as well have been kicking a tree trunk. Hot saliva dribbled from the thing's mouth and landed on his hand. Felix fought down the urge to flinch and kept moving, knowing that his life depended on it. Mad triumph appeared in the monster's small, beady eyes. It opened its jaws and bellowed so loudly that Felix thought he would go deaf. The creature reached for him, and from his prone position, Felix lashed out with his blade and caught it across the knuckles with the razor-sharp edge. The rat ogre's eyes went wide in surprise at the pain. Whimpering like a child, it pulled its hand back to its mouth to lick the wound. Taking advantage of its distraction, Felix half rose and stabbed upwards, driving the point of the sword right into the rat ogre's groin. The creature gave a shriek like the whistle of a steam tank and reached down to touch its severed nether parts. Felix drove the point of his blade into the thing's opened jaws, pushing it right through the roof of the mouth and into its tiny, malformed brain. The light went out of its eyes as it died instantly. Felix felt a momentary surge of triumph, which faded almost instantly as he realized that the rat ogre's corpse was going to topple on him. Felix sprang hastily to one side as the monstrous form crashed to the ground like a felled tree. Pausing to catch his breath a moment, he looked around. The last of the rat ogres was going down, the mercenaries swarming over it like rats over a terrier, but the victory had been won at awful cost. Many human corpses covered the ground for every rat ogre which had fallen. It looked like only he and Gotrek had bested one of the beasts in single combat. Still, briefly and temporarily, though it might turn out to be, it looked like the tide of battle had turned in their favour. The Skaven leaders, including the grossly fat monster which had ordered the rat ogres to attack, were fleeing backwards to regroup. More and more people were massing in the streets to fight off the invaders. In the distance, Felix could hear the sound of horns and drums as the small army which surrounded the noble quarter began to advance down into the city. He wished he had some idea of how the battle was going. In the raging maelstrom of conflict, it was difficult to say. They had won a victory here, but it was all too possible that the Skaven were triumphant in every other part of the city. Perhaps now would be a good time to make a run for it, he thought. Then he saw the Trollslayer. Gotrek marched through the crowd towards him. A terrible grin revealed his missing teeth. Mad battle lust filled his one good eye.
"You brought a good fight with you, Madling,"
he said. Felix nodded, and then remembered how this had all started. He fumbled into his tunic to retrieve the scrap of parchment, then slowly unrolled it to read its message. Grayseer Thanquol watched the last of his troops pass through the gateway, and then stepped through himself. He felt a sense of relief as the mystic portal closed automatically behind him. Even for a Grayseer of Thanquol's awesome powers, holding it open while hundreds of storm vermin poured through had been a terrible strain. Now he could relax and watch his plan unfold before him. His tail lashed in anticipation of his triumph. Victory was within reach. Soon he would hold the human rulers hostage and command them to order their troops to surrender on pain of most hideous death. If they refused, which Thanquol rather hoped they would, he would make an example of some of them until they did agree. He was looking forward to some sport. Then the twitching of his nostrils warned him that something odd was happening, and he squinted around the chamber to confirm his suspicions. Yes, it was true. Even Thanquol's warpstone-addled senses could tell that this room was the wrong size, and it did not smell like a great hallway. It smelled like a midden. Thanquol stuck his head through the door. He looked into a corridor, in which storm vermin milled in confusion. This was not the hallway they had been told to expect. He could see their claw leader studying his map with a look of puzzlement on his face. The awful truth dawned on Thanquol. That incompetent buffoon, Chang Squick, had placed his scrying crystal in the wrong place. Thanquol bared his fangs in a ferocious snarl. It was just as well for the Clan Eshin assassin that he was not in sight, thought Thanquol. The Grayseer swore that when he found Squick, he would flay his flesh from his bones, using the darkest magic that he could command. Warpstone-driven euphoria and drugged rage warred in Thanquol's mind as he stalked out into the corridor to search for his goal. Felix looked down at the parchment. It was hard to tell in the gloom, but the writing looked somehow different, smaller, neater, more precise. Not that it mattered right now, as Felix read in horror what it had to say. Humans. The traitor Grayseer Thanquol would invade the Palaz this night and capture the breeder Emmanuel and all your pack leaders. You must stop him, or your city will fall. Also, this Thanquol is a very powerful sorcerer, and will use his evil magic to stop you. He must die, or no human in your city will be safe." Felix looked down at Gotrek, then passed him the note. "Well," he said.
"Well, what, Manling?"
"Do we go to the palace and rescue our noble rulers from this Skaven menace?"
"They're your rulers, Manling, not mine."
"I think this Grey Seer is the thing we encountered in von Hallstadt's house. The rat man which got away. I think it might be behind this whole invasion."
"Then killing it would be a great deed, and dying in the attempt would be a mighty doom,"
Gotrek rumbled. "Only one problem, then. We're going to have to fight our way through the city to get there."
"Where's the problem in that?"
"Well, who knows how many rat men stand in our way?" Felix racked his brain for a way out of this dilemma. It would take an army to fight its way across the city. In a flash of inspiration worthy of a Detlef Sierck hero, the answer came to him. Lurk Snitchtongue cowered in the shadow of Isaac Grottle. The huge Clanmolder packmaster looked at him hungrily. He still seemed to be in a state of shock from watching the defeat of his prized rat ogres.
"I thought you said the human and the dwarf had received the message and were on their way to intercede with Grey Seer Thanquol." "The message was delivered, Master of Moulders. I cannot be held responsible for what happens next. Maybe they were caught up in the fighting." Maybe. All of this has left us exposed, though. Very exposed. We must find another Skaven force quickly, or return to the safety of the sewers." Yes, most perceptive of planners." "Have you seen Heskett One-Eye, or Vilebroth Nul?" "Not since we were attacked, greatest of gorgers." "A pity. Well, let us be on our way. At once."
Filled with warpstone-fueled rage, Thanquol stalked the corridors of the palace. The damnable place was huge, and it was as much a maze as anything he made his pet humans run through. His carefully contrived plan had fallen apart because of the incompetence of Chang Squick. It had relied on speed, surprise, and the fury of the Skaven assault to overwhelm the defence. Now his storm vermin were reduced to racing through the corridors and fighting skirmishes with groups of sentries. It was only a matter of time before the humans realised what was going on, concentrated their forces, and began to fight back. Thanquol still expected a victory under those circumstances. His warriors were many and bold, but there was always the possibility that something might happen to tip the odds against them. Thanquol would have much preferred a sudden, overwhelming victory, not this period of anger and doubt. Heskett One-Eye chittered in excitement. Once again he watched the warp fire throwers sweep through the buildings. These huge human structures burned well, their wooden supports caught fire easily, and the soft stone and brick from which they were made melted in the fierce heat of the warp flames. Heskett had thought it politic to separate from the others when his Jezzail team had accidentally shot one of Isaac Grottle's rat ogres. It was an accident, Heskett knew, but the Skaven of Clan Moulder were insanely suspicious. Heskett had no desire to have Isaac Grottle accidentally stab him in the back, so he had led his troops away from the main battle to continue spreading destruction. And how glad he was that he had done so. There was something truly enthralling about watching the machineries of destruction at work, of feeling the heat and flames his warriors had caused warm his face, and watching these giant structures tumble down. Heskett stared upwards for a long time, watching the tenement collapse. It was only at the very last moment that he realized that tons of brick and blazing wood were crashing down right on top of him, and by then it was far too late for him to escape. Felix leapt onto the back of the plague cart. Bodies squelched under his feet. The stink was appalling. He really would have preferred to stand somewhere else, but this was the only way he could get the attention of the crowd. "Citizens of Nuln!" he bellowed in the orator's voice he had not used since the window tax riots. "Listen to me!" A few heads turned in his direction. Most of the others were too busy hacking at Skaven corpses or shouting gleefully at their neighbours. "Citizens of Nuln! Skaven slayers!" he shouted. A few more people looked at him. They began to tug their neighbours' arms and point in his direction. Slowly but surely, Felix felt the attention of the crowd turn on him. Slowly but surely, the crowd fell silent. These people had seen him and Gotrek slay rat ogres. They had also seen them lead the charge into battle. These people were leaderless and in need of direction. Felix thought he could provide them with both.
Citizens of Nuln! The Skaven have attacked your great city. They have burned your homes. They have killed your loved ones. They have brought madness and plague to your streets.
Felix saw that he had them now. All eyes in the crowd were riveted to him. He could sense the crowd's anger and hatred and fear, and he could sense that he had given it a focus. He felt a sudden thrill at the power he held. He wet his lips and continued to speak, knowing that he must sway them to the course he wanted now, or he would lose them.
You have killed many Skaven. You have seen their monsters fall. You have seen their vile weapons fall. Victory is within your grasp. Are you ready to kill more Skaven?
Yes, cried a few of the crowd. Many still looked uncertain. For the most part, they were not warriors, just ordinary people suddenly thrown into a situation they did not truly understand.
Are you ready to drive the Skaven from your city? For if you do not, they will return and carry you away as slaves.
Felix had no idea whether this was true or not, but it was what they had done in the past, and it sounded good. More to the point, it sounded frightening. More voices shouted, "Yes!"
Are you ready to slaughter these monsters without mercy? For rest assured, if you do not, they will slaughter you. Yes! Roared the whole crowd in a frenzy of rage and fear. Then follow me to the palace, where the chief of all this foul breed even now threatens the life of your rightful ruler.
Felix leapt down from the cart and landed on the cobbled street. Hands stretched out from the crowd to pat him on the back. More still shouted their support. He saw Heinz and the surviving mercenaries give him the thumbs up. He looked down at Gotrek. Even the dwarf looked pleased.
Let's go,
Felix said, and they broke into a run. As one, the crowd followed them through the burning streets of the city. Chang Squick drew his long black cloak in front of his face and stalked forward, blade in hand. He kept to the shadows, moving quietly on the balls of his feet, ready to strike in any direction at the slightest provocation. In the dim distance, he could still hear the sound of fighting. From up ahead, he could hear the strange scraping noise that humans called music. He emerged onto a balcony and blinked his eyes, momentarily dazzled. He stood looking down upon a huge chamber. The vaulted ceiling above him was painted with an enormous picture of the human gods looking down benevolently. Enormous chandeliers, each holding hundreds of candles, provided dazzling illumination. Down below, an orchestra played, and many gowned breeders and a few costumed males stood at ease, drinking and eating happily. The smell of food made Squick's nostrils twitch and drew his attention to the tables below. They groaned beneath the weight of roasted fowl and pig. Platters of cheese and bread and all manner of savouries were there. So much for starving the city, thought the Eshin assassin. Then he realized that maybe the ordinary people were starving, but the rulers had preserved all these dainties for themselves. In this, then, the humans were not too different from Skaven, he decided. Then started at the sound of footsteps on the balcony behind him. Two figures, a male and a breeder, had emerged onto the balcony behind him. Their clothing was in a state of disarray, and it looked odd even for humans. The man was garbed as a shepherd in some sort of tunic. He carried panpipes, and a golden mask shaped to have small horns like a goat's covered his face. The woman, too, was masked, but she was dressed in some sort of dancer's costume, with diamond-patterned tights, a tricorned hat, and a domino mask. They stared at him, and to his surprise emitted the strange wheezing sound that humans called laughter. They stank of alcohol. Chang Squick was so surprised that he paused in the middle of his death stroke. He had intended to strike them down and withdraw into the shadowy corridors.
I say, what a super costume,
the man said.
Absolutely wonderful,
the woman agreed. She bent over and tugged at Squick's tail.
So realistic.
Squick had no idea what they were saying. He understood no words of their odd rumbling language, but it was starting to filter into his brain that these people were wearing some sort of costume, like high-ranking Skaven performing a religious rite, and they appeared to have mistaken him for one of them. Was it possible that these people were so drunk and so uncaring that they did not realize that there was a Skaven invasion going on outside? To his astonishment, Chang Squick realized that it must be so. Worse, He could see that all eyes down below were on them. He considered pushing the pair off the balcony and ducking back into the shadows, but that meant going back into corridors filled with fighting storm vermin and an angry Thanquol. Another plan struck him. Nodding politely to the two revellers, he put away his blade, walked down the stairs and into the crowds of masked and disguised humans. He helped himself to a savoury from a tray carried by a passing waiter, picked up a goblet of wine, and strolled through the hall, nodding left and right to those he passed. Perhaps if he could find the breeder, Emmanuel, he might yet redeem himself in the eyes of Grey Seer Thanquol. Vilebroth Nool looked up in astonishment at the onrushing horde of humans. Where had they all come from? How had they mustered such a huge force so suddenly? Had Grey Seer Thanquol underestimated their numbers? Certainly that was possible, and if so, just another example of the Grey Seer's incompetence. Not that it would make any difference if he did not get out of their way. He had spent the night, since the invasion force had erupted from the sewer, wandering lost through the twisting maze of alleys and lanes, killing any humans he encountered, and trying to locate Isaac Grottle and the others. He cursed the initial blind rush which had separated them all. Now he was left to face this horde of humans without any sort of bodyguard. He looked up and realized that he recognized the leaders of the charge, and what was worse, they recognized him. It was the human and the dwarf who had interrupted his ritual and destroyed the cauldron of 1,000 poxes. For a moment, a vast righteous anger swept through Vilebroth Nool. Almost without thinking, he summoned his powers, and an eerie green light swept into being around his head and paws. He mumbled the chant that would summon destructive spirits of disease to smite his foes. The humans did not even slow their headlong rush. Vilebroth Nool realized that they could not. The ones at the back were pushing the ones at the front of the herd forward. If the leaders slowed, they would be trampled. He kept chanting, desperate now to summon the powers which would protect him, knowing that most likely it was already too late. The humans were upon him. The last thing Vilebroth Nool saw was a huge axe descending towards his skull. Felix shuddered. He had recognized the green-robed rat man in the last seconds before the crowd had trampled it. It was the plague priest from the cemetery, and Felix was glad that it was dead. He was warm now, sweating from exertion and the heat of the blazing buildings which surrounded them. He tried to ignore the screams of those trapped within and focus on taking vengeance on those responsible. Somewhere off in the distance, he heard a crashing sound. A pillar of sparks rose skyward as a tenement collapsed. Felix knew that if anyone survived this, they would have their work cut out for them rebuilding the city. This was as bad as the Great Fire of Altdorf. They hit the slopes around the palace, and Felix noticed that many of the buildings here were intact. They were like his brother's house, small fortresses as well as mansions. Ahead of them was a force clad in the black tabards of the Nuln City Guard. They had their halberds raised to repel a charge, but lowered them confused when they saw that the mob were human rather than ratmen. "Skaven!" he shouted. "There are Skaven in the palace!" He did not know whether the captain of the guard believed him or not, but he did not have much choice. If his men stood there much longer, they would either have to use their weapons on their fellow citizens or be trampled underfoot. The captain made a snap decision. He barked an order, and his men stood aside. Felix could see that the great gate of the palace was still open. It must have been left that way to allow the coaches of the guests to enter, Felix decided. He rushed onwards, praying that they were in time to save Countess Emmanuel. Drexler turned to look in the direction of the scream. Suddenly the balcony seethed with huge, black-armoured Skaven. Those were not costumes. He could tell immediately. These were the real thing, monstrous, man-sized anthropomorphic rats, armed with huge scimitars and bearing round shields, inscribed with the sigil of their evil god. He saw a few of the guards, elite troops, move to interpose themselves between the guests and the Skaven. They were cut down swiftly by the disciplined phalanx as it poured down the stairs and into the room. Slowly the orchestra stopped playing. The notes faded out into discordant echoes. Screaming guests in fancy costumes were herded towards the great throne dais by massive snarling ratmen. Drexler wondered if he should risk a spell, but decided against it. There were too many Skaven for him to affect them all. Where were the guards, he wondered? Where were all the men who had gone to the battlements to look at the fire? Then he sensed the presence of terrible magical energy. Looking up, he saw a huge, horned, grey-furred rat-man descending the stairs. It looked like an evil god come to bring doom to all mankind. Thankwall strode forward across the corpses of the dead humans. At last, from up ahead, he could hear a gratifying number of screams. It seemed that his storm vermin had discovered the Great Hall at last, and that the human leaders were finally within his grasp. Filled with a tremendous sense of his inevitable righteous triumph, the Grey Seer advanced to victory. Felix led the charge into the courtyard. Looking up, he saw a struggle taking place on the battlements. "Quick!" he shouted to Heinz. "Scour the battlements! Kill any Skaven you find!" "Right-o, young Felix," Heinz said, rushing towards the steps with the mercenaries in tow. "Follow me, lads!" Felix glanced around at the mob pouring into the courtyard. They looked ferocious, ready to kill anything they saw. A number of them began to race after Heinz.
Where to now, Madling? Gotrek asked. I want to get to grips with that rat-man wizard. My axe thirsts for more blood.
Good question, thought Felix, wishing he had an answer. Think, he urged himself. Where is the logical place to go? The Grey Seer wanted to capture Emmanuel. Tonight, he knew from Drexler, a great ball was taking place. The logical place for the Countess to be was the ballroom that Ostwald
I'm
and he had
going
passed
to
through the
let
first
this
time he had
audio
visited the
finish, and
palace.
then the stream's ending.
Now,
y'all.
if only he could remember the way there.
Follow me!
He shouted, trying to make his voice as confident as possible. Thankwall paused at the head of the stairs to survey the great ballroom. He wanted to give the pitiful humans the chance to appreciate the full, awful majesty of their conquerors. He wanted to savor his moment of ultimate triumph. All eyes turned to look at him. He could tell the humans were impressed by his dignity and his presence. They always were. The majestic form of a Grey Seer always inspired respect and admiration in equal parts from all who saw him. He glanced at the crowd and looked around to see if he could find his chosen prey. In truth, he had expected to be able to tell her by the elaborate nature of her costume and by the fact that she wore a crown, but he could see that all the humans present were garbed in strange disguises, almost as if they had intended to thwart him. Well, he thought, they would see that a Grey Seer was not so easily balked. He singled out one of the human males, a man garbed like some primitive tribesman.
You, Manting, where is your chief breeder? Answer me, quick!
Thankwall asked in his best Reichspiel.
I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about, old man,
came the reply. Sweat dribbled down the man's face. Thankwall blasted him with a surge of pure magical power. Women's screams filled the air as the stripped and blackened skeleton of his victim fell to the floor. Thankwall selected another victim, a woman dressed like one of the humans' goddesses.
You! Tell me where is the chief breeder? Answer now!
The woman looked at him blankly.
What is a breeder?
She asked. Thankwall's answer was to blast her with magic as well. Another charred corpse tumbled to the floor. Thankwall selected a man very cunningly disguised as a Clan Eshin assassin.
You! The chief breeder! Where?
Thankwall bellowed. The disguised assassin turned, its tail twitching remarkably like a real Skaven.
No, master, don't blast me!
It cried in fluent Skaven. Remarkable, thought Thankwall. A human who speaks our language. Then he realized that this was no human. It was that damnable Chang Squick, hiding himself among the humans. Thankwall looked at the assassin and licked his lips, thinking of how the assassin's folly had almost cost Thankwall his triumph, remembering all the other failures Chang Squick had been responsible for. This was perfect, thought Thankwall. If anybody ever asked, he could claim that it was all a terrible error. He summoned all of his powers. Chang Squick screamed most satisfactorily as dark magic consumed his body. Thankwall gloated for a brief but joyous moment, then picked out another human.
You! Where's the chief breeder? Answer, quick, or your miserable life is forfeit!
But I don't know what a breeder is,
whimpered the fat man, garbed as a huge pink rabbit. Thankwall shrugged and blasted him. Yet more bones clattered onto the marble floor. It began to occur to Thankwall, even through the haze of warpstone clouding his mind, that there was something wrong with his strategy. The humans did not quite seem to understand what he was getting at. What could it be? Where were their feeble minds going astray? He had asked for their chief breeder, after all. Perhaps if he asked for her by name? He signalled out a cringing breeder and pointed one talon at her.
You! You! Are you the chief breeder, Emmanuel?
The breeder was obviously too overwhelmed by the sheer majesty of Thanquol's presence to speak. He blasted her as a lesson to the others that they should reply when he asked a question. He selected another male next, hoping that it would be slightly less witless than the breeder.
You! Where is the chief breeder, Emmanuel?
The male shook his head defiantly. I will never tell you. I have sworn to serve the Elector Countess. Thanquol yawned and unleashed another blast of dark magic before the human could finish its speech. He so hated it when they became contrary. His specimens back home in Skavenblight could be the same way sometimes, particularly after he took their breeders and runts away to experiment on. An amazing race in some ways, certainly, he thought, but so stupid. Out of the corner of his eye, Thanquol caught sight of two human breeders muttering to each other. Slowly he swung his burning gaze towards them. As one of the breeders straightened, and one of them strode towards him, she pulled off her mask to reveal a pale but determined face.
I believe you are looking for me,
she said defiantly.
I am Elector Countess Emmanuel.
Thanquol was almost disappointed. The warpstone power still surged within him, and he had been enjoying using it. There was nothing quite like the thrill of blasting lesser beings to bits, unless it was the sense of power doing just that gave one.
Good,
Thanquol said.
You will order your troops to surrender immediately, and I will let you live. Fail to do so,
Drexler shuddered as he watched the monstrous horned Skaven stride through the crowd. Just the sight of it filled him with fear. It wasn't the red glowing eyes or the way its fur bristled that scared him. It was the power it so obviously carried within it. Drexler's mystically attuned senses could see that the thing fairly bristled with dark magical energy. He was enough of a sorcerer himself to see that there was something deeply unnatural about it. No living creature should be able to wield or contain such power without suffering the consequences. At the very least, it should go mad. At most, it might explode, blown apart by the vast energy roiling within its body. Where could it have acquired such power, Drexler wondered. The only possible source of so much energy was said to be pure warpstone. Could the creature possibly be consuming this stuff? Such a supposition begged belief. Perhaps the creature had not escaped its use unscathed. Its slurred speech and stumbling jerky movements certainly hinted that something was wrong with it. The way its whiskers quivered, its head twitched, made it look as if it were in the terminal stage of some fatal addiction. Yes, the creature was mad, no doubt about it. The way it had so casually blasted apart anyone who did not answer its questions to its satisfaction stated that fact clearly. The question now was what was he, Drexler, going to do about it? He was appalled by his own cowardice. Each time the creature had gathered its dark powers, he had sensed it. He could have at least tried to work a counterspell, but he had not. He had been too overcome by the horror of the thing's appearance and the thought of what might happen to him if he had intervened. He felt sure that he would lose any mystical duel with this rat man, and that attracting its attention would be fatal. Even if he could somehow hold the Skaven mage in check, its black-armoured lackeys filled the room. At a word from it, they would surely cut him down with those cruel swords. So he had done nothing, and half a dozen people had died. He was proud of what Baron Blucher had done, the way the man had defied the Skaven before he died. Why could he not summon such courage? The healer in him was appalled that he had done nothing to prevent such loss of life. Now the Countess herself stood in peril, willing to give her own life to spare her subjects. Drexler vowed that this time he would intervene if the Skaven attacked. There would be no more magical killings if he could help it.
I will do no such thing,
Countess Emmanuel said shakily.
I would rather die than order my troops to surrender to you foul vermin. Foolish breeder! That is just what you will do if you defy me,
Thanquol said. He raised his paw, and dark magical energy played around it menacingly. The breeder flinched slightly, but did not move or open her mouth. Thanquol wondered if there was some way around this impasse. Perhaps if he ordered some of the humans tortured before her eyes, she would weaken. Thanquol's experiments had led him to believe such a course would often work.
Yes,
That was it. Then from somewhere around him in the ballroom, he sensed the slow build-up of magical energies. They were not Skaven magical energies either. He heard footsteps rushing closer too, even as he turned his head to seek their source.
Well, well, what have we here?
A harsh, grating voice said, like two great boulders rubbing together, cutting like a knife to the very core of Thanquol's being.
It looks like we're just in time to kill some rats.
Thanquol quelled the urge to squirt the musk of fear. He recognized that harsh, flinty growl. The grey seer jerked his head to one side, just to confirm his worst fears, and he saw that they were true. Standing in the entrance to the chamber were the dwarf Gurnison and the human Jaeger, and behind them was a teeming mass of human troops. Thanquol howled in frustration and rage. He reached deep into his corrupt soul and hurled all his lethal power at his enemies in one mighty blast. Felix prepared himself to spring to one side as he saw the midnight black thunderbolt gather around the grey seer's paw. The nimbus of evil mystical power around the Batman's head was so bright that it was almost impossible to look at. Gotrek held his ground unflinchingly, seemingly totally unafraid, as the enormous blast of destructive power was suddenly unleashed directly at him. There was a mighty flash and a crackling, booming noise, as of thunder unleashed directly overhead. The air was filled with the burnt metal reek of ozone. Felix was vaguely aware that two bolts of energy had leapt from the grey seer's paws. One was aimed at him, one was aimed at Gotrek. He closed his eyes, fully expecting to die. Instead of the anticipated blast of incredible pain, he felt nothing except a mild tingling on his flesh, and his hair starting to stand on end. He opened his eyes and saw that both he and the Trollslayer were enveloped in a golden field of energy. Long golden lines raced from the aura that surrounded them back to the hands of Dr. Drexler. Felix could see the look of strain on the doctor's face. Grateful as he was to the physician for saving them, he knew that the doctor could not long stand against the storm of magical power which surrounded them.
Is that the best you can do?
Gotrek bellowed.
Ratman, your life is over!
The Slayer charged through the corona of coruscating energy. Felix charged right beside him.
No!
Grey Seer Thanquol thought in panic, as he saw his two enemies racing towards him. This was not happening. How could this be? How could this abominable pair appear to thwart him in his hour of triumph? What evil deity protected them, and kept them alive to interfere in his plans time after time? He bared his lips in a snarl, and continued to unleash his destructive energies against the swirling golden shield which stood between the pair and destruction. He could feel it start to give way under the relentless pressure of his magical energies. Unfortunately, it was not giving way quickly enough. At the rate the human and the dwarf were closing the distance between them, they would reach Thanquol before he could shred their flesh and their bones. He snarled a curse and reined in his spell, knowing that something other than magic was needed now.
Quick!
He ordered his storm vermin.
Kill him! Now! Now!
With visible reluctance, the storm vermin moved to the attack. They had heard of this pair. Tales of the destruction they had wreaked among Skaven were legend among the army assaulting Noom. Their very presence was demoralizing to Thanquol's troops. The way the dwarf decapitated the experienced claw leader as if he were a mere puppy did nothing to reassure the Skaven. Nor did the vast howling tide of angry humans flowing into the ballroom. Thanquol sensed that the morale of his force was mere moments from breaking. Swiftly he weighed the odds of victory, and saw that his moment had passed, and that triumph had slipped through his talons. Now it was a case of measuring his chances of survival. If he left now, while his troops still slowed down the pursuit, Thanquol realized he might reach the privy. Once there, he could use the scrying stone to create a gate back to the sewers. Of course, now with his power at a low ebb, he would not have the strength to hold it open for all his warriors. In fact, he doubted that more than one solitary Skaven would escape through it. Still, he knew that the genius of Thanquol must be preserved. On another day, he would return and take his revenge.
Forward, my brave storm vermin, to inevitable victory!
Thanquol shouted, before he turned tail and ran with all his might. He did not need his grey seer's intuition to tell him that the slaughter behind him was going to be one-sided and merciless.